Good morning, everyone. Apologies for the late start. Let's just give it another 2 minutes to allow for participants to join, and we will get started. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning for this session on the budget, the national budget. The session will be unpacking Kenya's most highly anticipated budget statement in the recent history. And we'll be looking at the question, what should we expect going forward in the financial year 2023-2024 as business owners and as taxpayers in Kenya? I would like to introduce our two speakers today who will be unpacking the national budget for us and talking a lot about the implications, like I said, for business owners and taxpayers in Kenya. I'd like to welcome Lydia Abala. She's the regulatory lead for tax and regulatory services at KPMG. She's a lawyer with an accounting background. She's an advocate of the High Court with 9 years of experience cross-cutting corporate law, tax disputes and resolutions, corporate law, and regulatory compliance. Currently, Lydia heads the regulatory practice at KPMG, and she leads a dynamic team of professionals in corporate due diligence, legal audits, restructuring, employment law, immigration support, and tax disputes. She's been involved in assisting many clients, including international corporates, in helping them start their operations in Kenya in a very tax optimal way. We also have Ken Gishinga, who is the founder and chief economist at Mentoria Economics. His primary role is to provide clients with strategic insight on global, regional, and Kenyan economy. Prior to this, Ken served as a senior economist at Commercial Bank of Africa, now NCBA, as well as Equity Bank. Ken has also served as a business analyst at Microsoft Corporate in Seattle. He holds an economics degree from Harvard University and has been a recipient of the inaugural Business Daily Top 40 Under 40 Award in 2011. Every Tuesday, you can catch Ken hosting a weekly radio podcast at Capital FM titled Financial Podcast. For those of you who attended our last session on the finance bill, you would have interacted with these two speakers, and we're delighted to have them back with us today to unpack the national budget for us. Quick housekeeping before I hand over to Lydia. Please put in your questions in the Q&A tab, and we will address those towards the end of the session. We've dedicated at least 30 minutes of this session to answer all your questions. Please keep them coming as we move along, and we will address those questions. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over the session to Lydia and Ken to talk us through the national budget. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Eva, for that very warm welcome and introduction. And welcome members to this ongoing conversation that started about 4 weeks ago when the finance bill was first published for public participation. Building up on that, the Parliamentary Committee on Finance sat down, looked at the bill and made a few recommendations. And the climax of all that was last week, Thursday, when the CS National Treasury, Professor Njuguna Ndung'u, presented the new administration's maiden budget speech. And this was not in isolation. The other finance ministers across East Africa, Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, also did the same for their respective countries. And if you ask me, their themes, the themes cutting across all 4 countries were kind of similar. And specifically for the Kenyan economy, the theme as presented by the CS were around agricultural transformation, promoting small, medium, and micro enterprises in Kenya. Housing was a very prominent theme in his budget, healthcare, and the digital superhighway. And of course, as Ken will tell you in a short while, all this means more government expenditure, and that money has to come from somewhere. So in the next 30 or so minutes, Ken and I are just going to unpack this and bring it closer home in terms of what does that budget as read on Thursday mean to us as taxpayer, mean to us as business owners, and as certainly players in the Kenyan economy. So maybe just to start off, Ken, in his budget statement, the CS indicated the government expected expenditure for the next year to move to about 3.7 trillion Kenya shillings. In the year just ending, it's currently at about 3.2 trillion. And out of this, in terms of sourcing, the ordinary revenue expected to come from the Kenya Revenue Authority will be about 60% of these 2.5 trillion, up from their current budget of 2 trillion. In your own experience, having seen several bills, having read several budgets before this, do you think the current revenue targets set for the Kenya Revenue Authority is achievable? Do you think this forecast is something that they are going to meet? Because even as we stand today, it's not certain that they are going to hit the 2 trillion that they have.
Many thanks, and good morning, Lydia, and good morning to the AmCham family. It's a pleasure to be here again. And indeed, this budget was closely followed, as with the finance bill, and possibly has been the most discussed money bill in recent memory. Anytime you prepare a budget, normally there are key objectives that you're trying to achieve. And just from a very high level perspective of this budget, we see the CS of Treasury wants to achieve 2 things. He wants to achieve growth, and that's why he's expanding the budget size by about 8.6%. But he also wants to consolidate. So you're having an expansive growth budget, but also with consolidation objectives. So that will mean that this budget will mean different things for different people. Obviously, people who depend on government spending, suppliers, contractors, obviously they will like this, but also they realize that the taxation environment will go up. But to your question, will they hit this revenue target? Rarely have they done in the past. This last current year, they've achieved about 82% of it. So it's fair to expect that they might achieve something similar, possibly 80%. But however, the business environment is not what it was last year. There is monetary tightening, there's fiscal tightening. The business environment is that much tougher this year. So to the extent that they can even hit that 80%, I think I would even reduce it to possibly about 75%.
Yeah, and thank you for that, Ken. You mentioned there's an aspect of consolidation, even though they are still raising revenue, and we should expect tightening on government spending to some extent. While the intention to generate more revenue is clear to us in this meeting and as Kenyans, the government intention to reduce its expenditure, especially in its operational expenditure, is still not clear to most Kenyans. Do you think there are some other avenues that could still be explored by this government to possibly cut down its own expenditure and streamline part of the wastage that has been seen in use of public resources before? Do you think what is being done is enough? The minister spoke about streamlining hiring staff in state corporations. You mentioned a few of them. Do you think more can be done in just keeping the expenditure leaner to the extent possible?
Well, I think it has been a challenge. I think on the one hand, they have expressed the need for there to be more efficiency in terms of very basic things around meetings, for example. They argue, why can't they do meetings within the government buildings? Why do they have to go to hotels? Why do they have to, can they send emails instead of printing? So there have been what you'd call token measures that have been put forward. But at the same time, we've seen some offices getting much bigger allocations. And I think those mixed signals are possibly the ones that are sending things in different directions. What we do know is there will be some very aggressive cuts in the civil service. And for anybody who's interested in economic history, this is actually what happened in the 90s after those structural adjustment programs where we saw massive layoffs within the civil service. I really hope they don't go that direction, because that experience 30 years ago was a very difficult and a very painful experience. And we do hope that they look for wastage, possibly on the operational side. So I think that has been there. If you listen to what the economic advisor in the presidency office has said, he said that wastage is real. It's difficult to curtail, but it'll remain an ongoing objective as we move forward.
Yeah. And just again, like I said, the climax of the finance bill was obviously the Thursday budget speech. And if you listen to the CS, he was pretty much aligned to what the Committee on Finance, Parliamentary Finance Committee recommended. Their recommendations also tabled sometime last week. So assuming the bill is passed with the proposals as we know them today, without much change from the House, do you think the various changes, especially the ones targeted towards increasing revenue, are enough for KRA to raise the extra 5 billion that is required of them? The additional VAT on fuel, for example, the new tax bans, the higher taxes on sugar and other products. Do you think these would be enough for KRA to just bridge that gap from its current target, which you say is they are not meeting all of it anyway, at least from the projections we've seen? Do you think these new taxes are being introduced are enough to bridge this?
Well, let's focus on that singular part on the VAT on fuel. That, I think, appears in the entire finance bill. That appears to be the most contentious, and the specifics there are that VAT on fuel will be going up from 8% to 16%. You see, when the finance committee went to Naivasha and they were receiving feedback from the public, it was very curious that that's the one area that they were not having discussions at all. They were willing to have discussions on the housing fund, on any other part, but not the VAT on fuel. The expectation is if they raise it to 16%, their plan is they might raise about 50 billion shillings. But I think that's peanuts in the grand scheme of things, because what that will instantly do is it'll reduce the cost of goods and services across the economy, and it will reduce business activity and also obviously the revenue. So that 50 billion that we are raising will be more than offset by drops in business activity. And really that's what the Laffer curve in economics speaks to, that when you raise taxes to a certain level, businesses are disincentivized and business activity goes down. So I think the appeal they've been getting is to reconsider it. I mean, obviously they're very keen on it, but for me, if there's one thing that I'm worried about in terms of its cost on the impact on the economy, I think is that one particular bill. So I think on paper, they'll raise that 50 billion, but the questions we'll ask is at what cost will it reduce so many other of the other taxes that they're trying to build?
That's right, Ken, and you bring a very interesting perspective to it from an economist perspective, because then what happens in such situation is people coil back, and businesses, especially in the manufacturing industry, would be most affected. Would just now, the cost of doing business would be now more expensive, so they're likely to even be cutting of overheads, including some labor. And if you look at even the higher tax bands now introduced, 32.5 for those earning 500 Kenya shillings per month and above, how many of the taxpayer bracket are going to be brought into that net? Majority of Kenyans are, as we know, earn below 100,000 shillings per month. So really, while this is something they are really keen on, how much really is going to come out of it? And is this just going towards the general, enhancing the general skepticism around the public trust in this government? Because these are many changes being implemented at once. And to the next point, how this play out vis-a-vis the ever-soaring cost of living and inflation. And is there anything at all that the central bank or the incoming central bank governor expected to come in the next few months? What can they do from a monetary policy perspective to mitigate the situation? And on this, well, look at the interest rates, look at the depreciation of the Kenyan shilling against the major world currencies. Is there anything at all that can be done to just balance these changes out vis-a-vis the cost of living in this country?
I think you're absolutely spot on, Lydia. The numbers are quite staggering at the income level. Only 3% of the formal working environment earns more than 100,000 shillings. So if you're to look at how many earn over 500 and 800,000, it's possibly less than 0.5%. So the extent to which you can raise from that very, very tiny group is quite debatable. And it points to what we call the Gini coefficient, the inequality that we've seen in there. If you find most Kenyans in the formal working space are in that 30 to 50,000 shilling bracket. That's sort of like your median Kenyan working there. And if you're earning 50,000 shillings in Kenya, your take home today is about 29,000 shillings. That's only about 58% of your gross income. So massive deductions, and you've not added the housing fund, you've not added some of these things that are coming in there. So people's salaries have been eroded. Inflation has eroded the purchasing power, and people's pay slips are really at an all-time low, which means the purchasing power to go and buy goods and services becomes quite limited. So even as a supplier, as a manufacturer, I'd be very worried around the products that I'm providing in the market, because people will possibly be looking for cheaper, smaller items, and you already see that happening across the supermarkets. Now, what can be done on the monetary policy side? Yes, indeed, yesterday we saw the new governor taking office, Kamau Thuge. During the vetting, he raised a number of interesting proposals, but I think the key thing he needs to do is to reduce interest rates. Right now, Lydia, interest rates are extremely high and are prohibitive to doing business. If you look at the 7-year bond that was floated last week, it yielded at 15.8%. And that 15.8% it's tax-free. So if you actually, it's an equivalent of almost an 18% bond, if you think of equivalence in the market. When interest rates on government securities are that high, it means the credit to the private sector, which uses government bonds as a benchmark, becomes much higher. So we'll find businesses getting loans at 25%, at 23%, 24%, which makes the profitability of businesses that much harder. So I think there's a need for him to really look at how do we reduce interest rates. And the only way to reduce interest rates is to reduce government borrowing. And it's good in this particular budget that the fiscal deficit is lower. It's about 718 billion compared to last year's 850. So it's signaling lower borrowing. But at the same time, they are floating a proposal to raise the debt ceiling. And they want the debt ceiling to move away from the numerical limit of 10 trillion to a limit of 55% of GDP. If we go that direction, there'll be more temptation to borrow as the country's GDP grows. So for me, the short-term consolidation we are seeing, which is positive, I'm not very sure it will be guaranteed in the long term. I feel once we change that debt ceiling limit, people will want to borrow more. So it's a time where fiscal policy and monetary policy have to be aligned. On fiscal policy, we have to ask, how can we return Kenya to be a competitive, low tax environment? You know, I was hearing people saying the people at the highest band who will be paying 35%, they'll be paying higher than corporation tax. And there is no place in the world where people pay higher than corporation tax. So I think we need to return the issue of Kenya being competitive. And what makes a country competitive is when its tax base is low, when its interest rates are low, and when the regulatory space is friendly. That's what makes a very vibrant and competitive. So I don't think we should lose sight of that.
Yeah. You raise very interesting points. Some a bit triggering to Kenyans when you start talking about debt, when you start talking about the ceiling being exceeded, additional borrowing, and just picking off that, I know debt is a very hot theme for Kenyans right now, just like fuel, as you say, in terms of the government is obviously going to finance this 718 billion deficit through borrowing. Part of it is going to be domestic borrowing, and gladly I heard the CS say they're trying to keep foreign borrowing at a minimum. And he said about 160 billion is expected to come from IMF. Now, just based on that, can the country afford any more debt? And is it a necessary evil, so to speak, based on where we are? And I'll get to even the old loan repayments, that some of which are expected to come due in this new financial year. Can we really afford more debt as a country?
Well, Lydia, one of the last comments that the outgoing CBK governor made was that the capacity for domestic borrowing was highly constrained, which I think is true, because when you do any more borrowing, you crowd out the private sector. Part of that 213 billion that was bidded last week for that infrastructure bond, that's money that could have gone to ordinary businesses. That's money that could have gone to transformational things in our communities. And that money has gone to infrastructure bond. So it shows you how heavy government borrowing can crowd out the private sector, can make the cost of credit more expensive. And it points us to us having the need for a debt strategy. Now, debt can be useful to a country. Debt has its positive aspects, but also it has its negative aspects. The positive aspects of debt are, number one, during a crisis, let's say during a COVID crisis, during a natural disaster, debt can be used as a tool to be able to bring reprieve. If you look at COVID, governments had to spend about 3 to 4% of their GDP just on the welfare of their countries. And that's one positive use of debt for unintended outcomes, for emergencies. Number two useful thing about debt, which most people don't think about, is in smoothing out the revenue streams. And what do I mean here? If you look at how government raises revenue, much of it comes from things like corporation tax or dividends. But you see, corporation taxes come once a quarter, from companies. Dividends from government investments come about once a year and such. But the government needs to be making payments on a monthly basis. It needs to be paying salaries. It needs to be paying rent in some areas. So you find the revenue that you're getting in is coming in ad hoc basis, but your expenditures are almost every month. In fact, when you miss those obligations, like they did in March, it creates an international crisis where people say salaries are late, civil servants can be paid. So debt can be used to smoothen that process of income that is a bit staggered versus expenditures that are needed. The way that a bank overdraft, for example, will do for an individual. So that's another use of that particular debt. And in a sense, also, given the fact that you have a growing population, you need to cater for a bigger population. So you have more babies being born, you have bigger need for primary health care. That's another positive use of debt when you know that the population is increasing at 3, 4, 5%. So your budget every year needs to be expanding by that amount. If you put all those three categories together, it shows you that with debt levels of about 15% debt to GDP, let's say 5% on emergencies, 5% on smoothening government revenue, and another 5% on just keeping up with population growth, takes you to about 15% of GDP. But if you look at what is being proposed in terms of the debt ceiling, they're talking about 55% of GDP. Now that for me is extremely unreasonable. It points to the fact that we are not learning our lessons about debt, because what will be happening when the GDP is rebased, and every few years, GDP is rebased. When that GDP goes up, we'll be going on a borrowing spree. So I think, first of all, they need to shelve that idea of having a debt ceiling at 55% of GDP, possibly raise the current 10 trillion to maybe about 12 or 13 trillion and keep it at a numerical limit. But in the long term, we need to really think of really drastically reducing our debt to GDP to only the areas that are truly, truly important.
Yeah, Ken, and it sounds to me like the debt stress over the coming year will even be more intense, because from the budget thread, I didn't hear the CS focus or make any pronouncements around the expected loan repayments that are coming due in the next year, which are at about 850 billion in principle. So I don't know what options the government has on the table, and just based on the deficit they already have and the statistics you've shared, then they may even refinance these loans. And what this means is even a higher deficit than the 718 that as we know it in this meeting. So it's really a tough balancing act to meet the expected loan obligations, which, if you ask me, cannot be postponed. They are due. It's a priority area. And do you think, based on just that, do you think the development budget is likely to suffer? And the other alternative is the government likely to struggle in meeting its recurrent financial obligations in terms of even just paying salaries for civil service? And of course, this has a trickle-down effect on everyone in the economy, because then if the civil service is not paid, then even the shop owner in the village, money is not coming down in terms of people spending. Do you think the development budget is likely to suffer? And compare that against even the government's ability to meet its recurrent financial obligations.
As you've said, that debt repayment is a priority. It has what is called the first charge on the exchequer, meaning that every revenue that's raised by KRA, really the first item that has to be sorted out is what is in the consolidated fund. That's where all debt repayments are put in. There are a couple of other non-debt things, like the salaries of the president, the chief justice. They're also in the consolidated fund, but the overwhelming part is on debt repayment. Now, to your point, we have some really big obligations coming up next year. On June 24th next year, we have a whole 2 billion euro bond that needs to be paid. They say they have put in a team to look at how to achieve this. But at the same time, they say they're considering multiple options. So it seems they are still at the advisory stage where they're talking to multiple advisors. My expectation is they will be able to pay that debt, but my worry is at what cost. As you've said, I feel that repayment will consume so much revenue that issues of what we saw in March with the delayed salaries could start becoming more frequent, because from a revenue perspective, the outlook for this year is for a slowdown, not just in Kenya, but in Africa and globally. So the extent that you can try and raise more revenue during an economic slowdown, indeed has to be challenged. So for me, I think the debt will be managed, but what will that mean for contractors who are doing business? The contractors, one of the big stories had been about the issue of the late payments being put together into a bond. I think about 512 billion being put together into a bond, but the Treasury CS, I think he said that's not feasible. So that's not going to happen. What they will do is they'll come up with a committee to look at pending bills. So for me, it tells me that we are looking at a very constrained period, both on the fiscal side and on the monetary side. It means that the cash in circulation might be quite limited. And also the things that have boosted us, like diaspora remittances, might also be a challenge, because our counterparts in those countries are also being affected by the harsh global economic times. So remittances will also be an issue.
Yeah, Ken. It would be interesting. It's good to hear that the government has this under the radar, and it would be interesting to see the outcome of the advisory of the task force that has been put together in anticipation of these big financial obligations that we expect in the next financial year. Moving away from that, I'll just come back again to the key priority areas for the government that I mentioned when we started this session. Reading the Finance Committee's recommendation on the finance bill, following the conclusion of the public participation exercise, I got the feeling that they really tried to balance revenue, but also listen to what we told them when various stakeholders, including the AmCham family, submitted their proposals for consideration. They listened, they've tried to really strike a middle ground, and part of the changes proposed, in addition to reducing, say, the housing levy, part of it was just to make the special economic zones and the export processing zones more attractive in terms of doing business in Kenya. Do you think this is something that businesses, somebody listening in this meeting today, can take advantage if the changes to the special economic zone and the export processing zones are passed as they are? Because then you obviously get preferential tax rates, you get to enjoy certain tax holidays, so to speak, for a period of time when you're still investing in the countries. Do you think they are onto something in terms of just also balancing, making Kenya an attractive destination for doing business?
Indeed, I think that was a positive side to the budget, really them identifying that Kenya can export more than its traditional items. Kenya has been long associated with just tea and coffee and such. And there is a view, particularly within the African Continental Free Trade Arrangement, that Kenya can be able to, supply milk to countries such as DRC. And that's why Kenya has been a big champion of the Africa Continental Free Trade. That's why the president has been very keen on a single payments platform for Africa. And I think that's why they want to set up countries, these EPZs, to be able to look at the external perspective, the external growth for these countries. Moving on, I feel the challenge though will be, yes, as we boost in the export, we also have to look, that's a supply side. We also have to look at the demand side of a country, because what drives business, the economy, is demand. Demand is what makes the supplier want to go and supply things. And if you look at that budget, one of the big talking points, which nobody has really discussed, has been the issue of the national tax policy. And if you look at one of the paragraphs, the CS talks about putting that budget according to the national tax policy. Now, that's a document that a lot of Kenyans have not interacted with. That's a document that very few people, a lot of people thought it was in the drafting stage. A lot of people have given comments, but I think a lot of people need to look at that document to interrogate it in terms of what it means to demand. So I think moving forward, they can boost the supply side, but they have to look at the demand side. And the demand side means you have to lower taxation for the population, because lower taxation means people can consume more. And when people consume more, the suppliers come in. But from the export special economic zone perspective, I absolutely believe Kenya can be a leader in the continent. Kenya can be really a leader in terms of supplying not just agricultural equipment, but services such as education, transport, and storage. So I think they should continue, particularly with that Pan-African view.
Correct. And I also think as business owners, or as advisors to business owners, it's not all gloom and doom. Like Ken says, that aspect on promotion of exports in terms of the EPZ and the SEZs was a good thing we had from the budget. It's just now the taxpayer to come down and read and see how can I take advantage of this. Among others, there's the amnesty, which is, of course, it's a transition clause, but between now and the cutoff date, which is June 2024, what can you do as a business? Can you look into your affairs and see if any tax is due, you pay before then? Because we expect that going forward, there'll be no longer waiver of penalties and interest if at all KRA is going to meet those supernormal targets. Last question to you, Ken. We expect now that the report stage of this bill has been concluded and the committee has reported back to the House, we expect the bill to be tabled before Parliament through a third reading and a vote taken. And ultimately, this will culminate in the Finance Act 2023 being passed effective 1st July this year. What does this mean in terms of doing business in Kenya? I know you've mentioned a few pointers here and there, but in just as a parting shot, what does this mean to us in terms of doing business in Kenya? What are the key strategies as a business owner that you yourself would advise or would employ to just survive for the next 1 year?
That's a fantastic question, Lydia. Indeed, this is a time for strategy. Once this act is passed, obviously today I expect another heated round of debates, but we do believe our government has the numbers to be able to see it through. And now companies will need to adjust their strategies. And I think it's very important that now we have to become sector by sector, because some sectors will do well and others might have a challenge. If you think of education, for example, it has the highest allocation in the budget. It's gone from 540 to about 630. So a player in the education space would be looking at quite a positive sort of angle, because there is more capitation, particularly for junior secondary. given the opportunity to set it up. So I think it's time for business leaders now to go back, now that we have had the collective understanding of where the government wants to go back to our sectors, to do a sector review, to see what are the opportunities in the particular sector, because what's happening in manufacturing will be different from what's happening in education and services. Obviously, services continues to be a big growth space. It tends to be one of the key drivers of the Kenyan economy. But business leaders, we need to now look at their particular sector and ask, what does this new Finance Act mean for the media industry? What does it mean for changes in the media sector? So those has to be sector specific. Here at Mentoria, we do try to publish weekly reports on things that are happening in the economy that would be useful for strategy. So people might be willing to subscribe to those reports. We publish them every Monday, but there is quite a number of things that are happening every time. I believe, for example, now that the currency is hitting 140 today, somebody would want to start asking, how can we become an export-oriented business? Because when the currency is depreciating, you want to be on the export side of business because you become more competitive compared to other players in the market. So I expect to see more businesses asking, how do we take advantage of the export, the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement? How do we export so that we are earning foreign exchange for this country? I think that's one tangible strategy that business can look at, to not just be inward looking, but look at what are the opportunities in the region globally that we can export our services to.
Thank you, Ken. Those are very real pointers. And what I pick from that is even coming down to your contract negotiation, for those of us who even export services, it is time now to rethink how you negotiate in terms of currency. It's more profitable and it makes more economic sense if you negotiate your contract no longer in Kenya shilling, but in foreign currency, especially the high value ones, the euros, the GBP, the USD, instead of insisting to be paid in local currency. So that's one strategy that I've picked out from your advice, Ken, and it's something to take forward in the next coming year based on what we've discussed. There are a couple of questions on chat, and thank you. Thank you, Richard. I see Stanislaus, I see Alex. I'll just read them out, then I'll allow you, Ken, to take some of them, and some I will answer from this end. So the first question is from Richard. Richard is asking, and thank you, Richard, for the compliment. Looking at the national tax policy, how has this budget advanced the long-term goals of the policy? And I think, Ken, you've briefly alluded to the national tax policy that we have. And what Richard is asking is, how is this overlapping with the budget that we are discussing today?
That's a very good question. I think what I said at the very beginning, there seems to be two objectives being pursued here. That Kenya to continue growing at its normal 5%, but also Kenya to be able to be more prudent in terms of debt and debt sustainability. Those appear to be the two objectives of this budget. But from a longer term perspective, I always say we need to be more competitive as a country in terms of our macro fiscal arrangement. I think the long-term objective of economic planning has to be able to make the country more productive with the idea that higher productivity can lead to higher standards of living. And I think that's the ultimate goal of a good budget, to raise the standards of living of people. So when people look at the year 2030, they need to expect that the standards of living in the year 2030 will be so much higher than the standards of living today. And now all the policies that needs to be put together to enshrine that have to be put in place, and they have to work in tandem with other policies. We have a Vision 2030 that's already behind the scenes that has been operating. The previous administration had a big four, but I think the ultimate objective has to be able to be on the issues of raising the standards of living. And how do you raise the standards of living? For me, it's touching on things such as healthcare. Are you having more doctors? Are you having more drugs? Are you having more teachers? Education. Are you having more schools around the country? Is there more food being grown in the country? Is the country more secure? So the challenge with the budgets is they will tell you where the sectors the money is going to. Like I've talked about, education will be getting 630. But somebody will want to ask, in that 630, how much of that is going to recurrent, just paying salaries? How much of that is going to building new schools? Now, that kind of granularity you will not get from the budget. That you have to possibly go to the Ministry of Education, put your analysis together. It's much more rigorous. Same thing for healthcare. How much money, the money that's going to healthcare, how much of it is going towards salaries of doctors, and how much of it is going towards maintenance of equipment, getting new equipment. Now, the budget does not give you that level of granularity, and that's some of the things that we try to do now, to go a bit deeper, go to the ministries, and be able to achieve some of that.
Yeah, Ken, as you are speaking about education having the highest allocation, and at the face of it, it looks like a big win for that sector. And you're saying there's need to further interrogate on how much of that, for example, is going to be spent here in Nairobi for conferences, benchmarking exercise in the US or in Mombasa for 1 week. Because while at the face of it, it looks like a good thing, then is it properly apportioned? Is it going to, if say the healthcare allocation, is it going towards buying new equipment for our referral hospitals, for example, so building more hospitals, or is it going into endless conferences by the officials? So that's something also to keep in the back burner, that high allocation does not necessarily mean a win until that apportionment is seen to be going towards the priority areas as the normal citizen would anticipate. A couple of questions from Stanislas. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. The first one, the assumption is that anyone earning less than 500,000 per month will not be impacted by the new pay bands. Is this so? That is correct. That is the understanding, because then the target is on anyone earning between 500 to 800, they'll be subjected to 32.5% additional pay band, and anyone beyond 800,000 then 35%. The second question from you is, did the Finance Committee make any adjustments to the previous proposal of withholding tax being deducted and remitted within 24 hours? Yes, not quite substantive change, if you ask me. They've recommended 3 days, 24 hours and 3 days. If you ask me, still the same thing. The administrative burden is still there. So yes, slightly different. They've recommended 3 days. How that would work out remains to be seen. And this is something that it looks like they're really insisting on. And from the last conversation we saw, they were saying this has worked for the betting companies. But what they are not telling us is that the betting companies' ERP systems or accounting systems are actually linked with the KRA systems. Do we really want to do business in such a setup where your ERP system is linked with KRAs, considering the various data privacy restrictions, the various business confidentiality requirements? How that is going to be implemented remains to be seen. But again, what I see, what business owners would do would just then to just do bulk invoicing. So that's a risk also that the government faces. Because if they really insist in, say, the 24 hours or the 3 days, then what businesses may be tempted to do is just to hold on your invoices to a certain day of the month, and then do all the remitting within the 24 hours or within the 3 days. again, that would impact cash flows at some point. Because think about what the business owners are really struggling with, at least what I know my clients have struggled with is, what do you do where withholding tax is due on accrual, where it's not actual money, but you are just accruing that cost and you are required to remit withholding tax on money that has still not even hit your account within 3 days, still not addressing the taxpayers' concerns, but they changed it. The other question from you is briefly expound on repatriated profit. I'm assuming you're asking for branches and the logic behind this. Are there jurisdictions that have done this successfully? So the rationale for the government proposing to tax repatriated profits by branches is hinged on reducing the income tax rate for branches from the current 37.5% to 30%, like is currently the case for subsidiaries or registered companies here in Kenya, the 30%. So it's just streamlining the treatment of resident companies and the foreign branches so that they are treated equally. Still, if you ask me, remember branches are not allowed certain deductions. Still, that has not been addressed in this finance bill. So even though the rates are now the same and withholding tax on repatriation is now the same for registered resident companies vis-a-vis branches, the section on allowability for deductions has still not been dealt with. And that also needs to be streamlined if this is to work. There's a question here from Alex Masika, and I'll read this out to you, Ken. The housing levy hasn't really been reduced. With the 3% in the finance bill, there was a cap of 5,000 shillings. With the now 1.5% as read out with by the CS, there's no cap. I would like to hear your thoughts regarding that.
Yeah, indeed. I think after the VAT on fuel issue, the housing levy has actually sort of been the second most contentious issue, not least because it keeps morphing almost every week from savings fund that will be compensated afterwards into a tax. That means once the money has gone, it's gone, like any other tax. So for me, very quickly, I think it points to an idea that's being rushed. It's not been well thought through. Anytime you have a policy that is morphing every week, it means the policymakers have not really taken time. It does feel very rushed, and I don't see any problem with it being postponed to a future fiscal year when it's been thought through with other thoughts, including the thought that housing is a devolved function. And if we were able to support counties properly, they can be able to meet their housing objectives. There's also the argument that many people are already climbing the property ladder, have mortgages that are already in place and are already getting those deductions and would not wish to be part of this. So I think these are the things that when you're designing public policy, these are the things that have to be put in place, and you don't feel all those thoughts have been put in place. And I think that's why it's creating such a huge pushback, particularly from the public, even in its amended form. I feel it's still something that the government will continue to push. They say that it will create jobs in other sectors, which is true. Anytime you build a house, there's a labor force that is required, there's a material that is required. But ultimately, the way you want to create jobs in an economy is just creating an enabling business environment, an enabling environment where players, both in the housing market and those in the non-housing market, can thrive. And the only way you can do that is by what I said earlier on, having a low tax base, having friendly interest rates, and a regulatory environment. That's the way you create jobs. So I really hope I know it's a tough hope, but I really hope they really try to reconsider this particular one, because it's very likely that it might go to the courts too. If it actually passes in the Finance Act, it's very likely that it might be taken to the courts again, and there'll be sort of like further contentiousness. I think it hurts them not be able to repackage it in a way maybe that makes it almost voluntary for the people who would want to participate in it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. I think you've answered that question very spot on. There's a point for clarification here on our previous discussion from Kelly. Kelly is asking, Ken, would you please clarify the comment on strategies to employ going forward in the wake of depreciating Kenya shilling? Did you say local businesses should now start invoicing in USD? I'll read one more question, then you can take both of them at once. From Joe. Joe is asking, can you please elaborate more on the previous discussion on the issue of VAT registered businesses? Can we, are we now only required to do business with firms that are VAT registered, and otherwise we may not offset expenses if not supported by Team's invoice? So you can take the two questions from Kelly and Joe.
Many thanks for those questions, Kelly. Indeed, once the budget has been read, once the finance bill becomes a finance act, it's up to now business leaders now to go back to their companies and to look at what this new environment means for your industry, whether you're in media or banking or telecommunications. It's a time now for some soul searching in terms of how do we remain competitive? What's our competitive advantage? How has the market changed? Do we need to change our prices? Is technology going to disrupt many things as people become price sensitive? People do look for technological solutions to get the same services. So it's a good time to start working to refresh your strategy broadly speaking, and that's one area where we do assist. But I think on the currency thing, it is important to be quite keen on the currency strategy, particularly if you have export services. For example, we on our side, we have foreign clients who sit out in Oman, and we signed a contract to help them on a project back in April. But when they were paying us just last month, they said that they're going to pay us, it was in dollars, but at the rate that when the deal was being signed. So you can imagine in April, the dollar was at about 123, and today we are talking of 135, 136, today 140. So it tells you that had we been a bit smarter, we should have said that all invoices in dollars should be paid at the prevailing rate, not at the time, not the rate at the time when the contract was being signed, because that meant we left quite a bit of change on the table. I think in terms of Alex's concerns, it points to the issue of the tax policy. And that's why I keep saying the tax policy for a country needs to be extremely important. And I wish Kenyans had more time to interrogate that tax policy, because a good tax policy should start with the principles of taxation. Number one, it's fairness. Number two is equity. Number three, which speaks to Alex's question, is the issue of convenience and ease. If you are looking for a service provider, you need to be looking at the best service provider for a particular service, for a particular good. But when you have a heavy administrative burden on taxation, the criteria for choosing the people you want to do business with become, are they VAT compliant? Are they? So it moves the conversation from who's the best placed person with the best skills and the best services to a conversation on who is the most compliant, who is the most, and it changes the conversation. And that's why I keep saying we need to make our tax policy to be very easy in terms of administration. When you ask every kiosk owner to have ETR machines, you need to ask, are we making their lives easier or are we making their lives harder? And that's why I keep saying that tax policy, which I think is being invoked in this budget, I think Kenyans need to sit down, to look at it. I don't think it's been properly even debated by Parliament. And I think that's also some of the things that need to be looked at. So what we're left with is definitely we want to work with the right people, but also we want to make sure that the best skills in the market are not being hindered by a lot of administrative red tape.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll take two more, even as we wind up. Jeff, you're asking, what do you see as the impact that the Act will have on the media industry? In addition to the changes to branch companies, if at all you're operating a branch, there are certain changes that would be specific to the media industry. The first one that comes to my mind straight away is the requirement to withhold 5% tax on payments to the digital content creators. The mainstream media relies a lot on influencers for advertisements or such things, where you're making payment directly to these service providers. The new, there's a proposal to now withhold 5% tax and remit to KRA within the 3 days of the 24 hours previously proposed out of the revenue or the amount payable to them. So that would certainly impact the media industry from an administrative perspective and even from a negotiation perspective, because ultimately then this is likely to increase the cost of advertisements, because this cost somehow has to be absorbed in some way, shape or form. So the influencers would, I think, I'd want to think they'd want to raise their prices or negotiate more because of this new tax that was previously not there. Again, the timelines for withholding tax would certainly affect the media industry. Again, and I'll answer, Jeff, my answer to this second question would also affect the media industry. And this question is from Caroline. Caroline is asking, what about VAT on export of services? Is it zero rated, exempt, and how will that impact consultants? Caroline, the short answer to that question is it's a bit confusing now, because the bill proposed to have export of services exempted. But then if you read the report from the Finance Committee, the Finance Committee's report, they use the word zero rated and exempt interchangeably. In the beginning of the report, they say they are recommending that it be exempt. As you go towards the end of their report, they say they have agreed that it should be zero rated. So it's kind of conflicting in that regard. When the CS read the budget on Thursday, he said VAT on export of services will be removed. As to what removed means, is it zero rated or exempt, is a bit kind of confusing. And if you ask me, following the report, between the report and the budget, it left most of us confused. So the answer to that question is, at this point, let's wait and see after the debate what will be adopted, because they are using those words interchangeably and they obviously do not mean the same thing. The hope is it be zero rated, because that would mean you're able to claim your input VAT. So we really hope that the initial exemption in the report was a typo, and that the CS reference to removal of VAT, he actually means zero rating. The other question, again, is from Stanislas, and this is to you, Ken. There's been a theory that the measures in this budget are mainly due to conditions by IMF, especially with the constrained domestic borrowing. Is this really the case? And the final question is from you, Sylvia. How will it influence foreign investment? Sylvia, I am assuming, since your question just came in, do you mean the policy? Maybe you can just type again to provide more context. Do you mean VAT on exports, or do you mean the tax policy? Even as Sylvia clarifies that, Ken, you can take the first question.
That's, I think, a very good question when you think about the country as an investment destination. Obviously, what makes Kenya attractive as an investment destination is it has a youthful labor force, very young, median age, 19 years, good infrastructure, and really a diversified economy that attracts people. So Kenya still remains an attractive place to do business, but indeed, if taxation starts getting in the way, I think in one of the last week's headlines, we read about millionaires who are leaving the country, because of the tax climate. So I think we have to make sure that we encourage the Kenya as an investment destination continue to be the most competitive, because the region is coming up. Rwanda is really coming up in terms of ease of doing business. And I think it will continue to be in that direction. So I think that's what I said. The long-term objectives of policy is to make the country the most competitive possible in terms of its possibility to attract investments, not just for foreign investors, but also for domestic investors.
Thank you for that, Ken. Maybe you can take one more question, then we can close. I see Stanislav had asked something on IMF. Some of these changes motivated by the IMF conditions.
Oh yeah, that's a very important question. And indeed, Kenya has been part of an IMF program, a 38-month IMF program. I think right now we are right in the middle, I think in the 19th month. And definitely things such as VAT on fuel, those ones you can almost entirely conclude those are IMF proposals. If only looking at the body language of the Finance Committee that said that we're not discussing this, we're discussing any other thing except that. So Kenya really is looking for concessional debt. The IMF, the World Bank, they provide concessional loans, which means they're cheaper than commercial loans, which Kenya had been having for the last few years. But the challenge with concessional loans is they do come with conditions, and definitely, for example, the VAT on fuel is most likely one of those many conditions.
Yeah. So I think we've answered the questions on chat, and mine is just again to thank everyone for engaging and asking those thought-provoking questions. And we also, I personally has also learned from this session and from you, Ken, especially. And these are things that not only affect us in the context of as professionals, but even as business owners, even as employees, even as advisors in wearing different hats. And again, I am challenged to just go further beyond the various allocations, the high level billions and trillions as discussed this morning, and interrogate how does this come into play with the larger tax policy at that level? How does this come into play in terms of the granular allocations that Ken alluded to? That is all the time we had for this morning, but you can be sure that there is more to be discussed. The conversation is going to get even more heated in the coming week as the debate is finalized and ultimately the act is passed into law. But my challenge to all of us is to keep talking, to keep engaging, and just to also exchange ideas on how to do business in this ever-changing fiscal environment. With that, I'd like to hand over to Maxwell for some closing remarks and possibly a formal closure of this session. Maxwell?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Lydia. Thank you, Ken. I think this has been a very illuminating conversation this morning. Just one point of clarification or perhaps correction. I thought that the Finance and Budgeting Committee reviewed the 24-hour withholding tax what do you call it, submission to 5 days and not 3 days, actually 5 working days and not 3 days. Is that the case? I see Ken is nodding, because Lydia, you had said 3 days.
Yeah, it was increased to 5 days.
Yeah, as I was just speaking, a colleague chatted me, and I was just going to also clarify that on chat. And thank you for bringing that up. It is actually 5 working days. Thank you.
All right, fantastic. Then one question from me, actually for both of you. You know, whenever the changes in the finance bill, when they become an act, most of them tend to take effect immediately, right? So once the Finance Act is passed, by 30th of this month, 1st of July, some changes will be taking effect immediately. Of course, some of them have quite significant administrative considerations from a business perspective. And we've always seen instances where we try to push back and just try and get a slightly longer lead time to prepare for companies to prepare themselves to be able to implement some of these changes. Do you think it's high time then we start looking at a situation where changes in the finance bill will then have a certain period of time with which companies are allowed to prepare themselves, you know, from an administrative perspective, from a cash flow perspective, so that they're able to comply in a reasonable manner? You know, this could be that changes done, say, this year, then start taking effect maybe the next financial year, that sort of thing. It just, I think that would be a much fairer way of looking at it. Of course, I'm speaking purely from a business perspective. Government folks will tell you, hey, we need to raise this revenue immediately. But just to hear your thoughts, what do you think about that sort of approach?
Maxwell, I think you are onto something very important here. The second half of the year tends to be, economically speaking, more vibrant than the first half of the year. Many companies roll out their new strategy in the second half from July 1st, just because of the better economic environment. So it can come as a dampener when, as you are launching your new strategy, a well thought out strategy, you're trying to make the best out of the year, then a new taxation comes in and completely changes your pricing, completely changes your competitiveness. I think it would be a great idea if some of those things could be commuted into future, possibly say January 1st next year. At least you have 6 months to enjoy the second half of the year, and also to prepare well on what that would mean for strategy. So I think that's a very, very reasonable proposal.
Okay, thank you. Well, we are already over time. So mine is just to say thank you once again to both of you, Lydia, Ken, of course, representing KPMG, and Mentoria, for your support in this really, really important conversation. One, as everybody has acknowledged, it's quite very close to the hearts of taxpayers, to the hearts of business leaders. And for us as AmCham, we have been closely monitoring this. We've appeared before the Finance and Budgeting Committee to present our submissions. We are glad that some of them have actually been taken into account from the report that we saw from the Finance Committee. And so we are really hopeful that those changes will actually be adopted when it comes to the vote of the full House this week. So mine is to say thank you again to our audience for their participation, for sending in your questions. Our undertaking as AmCham is to ensure that we keep convening these sorts of platforms to be able to edify our members and of course those who are in the ecosystem that we are part of, to ensure that we are staying abreast of what is happening. But at the same time, we use these platforms to ensure that we're actually able to get input, ideas, thoughts, such that when we are engaging with policymakers, we're actually able to present that appropriately to them. And so with that, ladies and gentlemen, I want to wish you all a wonderful day ahead. And we've come to the end of this particular session. Thank you and have a nice day. Bye-bye.